Evening, everyone. Hello. So we're going to be discussing Brexit. Don't often do that on the streams. Now, someone, let me find out who. Again, pick you out. Can't find it now. Someone did sort of ask, and I can't find it now, saying what are the chances? Oh, here we go. It's John. What are the chances of a general election this autumn out of 10? I would say very slim. I wouldn't even say one in all honesty. You can't ever rule it out. But ask me later in the stream because I'll show you something in terms of explaining why. But we're going to discuss Brexit because I'll tell you what's really intriguing me at the moment. You may have guessed from the videos today is I don't know what sort of Brexiteer Rishi Sunak is. Because I'm not actually convinced by the pragmatic Brexiteer line. I think he's just, his Brexit moves have been just to stop the economy collapsing. The bottom line is, people, like, it comes down in some ways to the answer of why did he want to become Prime Minister? And it's really easy and it's really compelling to think that it was just to be the first non-white Prime Minister page in the history books, or to cream off a load of money for his wife and his father-in-law's businesses, because that's happened, but it doesn't quite ring true. All of that, I'm sure, has been something he's happy about, but it doesn't ring true enough. And I'll tell you the reason why. It's because he gets, according to reporters, I don't talk to him, but according to reporters, he gets genuinely tetchy about the election, right? The general election. He gets really upset about people saying he's going to lose. That tells you that he actually thinks he has a chance of winning, or at least he can try and maneuver himself into a position where he's got a chance of winning. So you have to think, so why did he want to become Prime Minister? I'm not entirely sure. And part of, you can look at his Brexit. He could be as ideological a Brexiteer as someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, really. They're similar sorts of people in many ways. But so why is he softening Brexit? Why the ERG upset at him? Because he knows that the economy cannot actually be in the dustbin come the election. If he's going to have, again, he wouldn't worry. I don't think he would worry if he's not giving up on the election. Whatever he wanted to become Prime Minister for, it wasn't just a short-term gig, right? He wants to win the election. He's got no political acumen. He can't win the election, certainly not doing what he's doing. But he wants to, and he knows that the economy has to be at least partially dug out of the hole to have any chance, which is why, for example, he's binned that UKCA mark, because that was a load of cobblers anyway. I mean, that didn't even do anything for, if you think about the sort of Brexiteers who just wanted the deregulation, the UKCA mark didn't do that, didn't really do that. It was just a Boris Johnson vanity project, all it ever was. No one really, I don't think anyone's really upset at it's leaving. Uncle's social, they're saying, Info, have I seen the latest news that the NHS is already unprepared ahead of this Christmas? Yeah, well, yes, it comes as no surprise. Remember, the traditional NHS winter crisis that we get during Tory governments, we got them under Thatcher and Major. Then somehow, I don't know how, I mean, someone let me know. They disappeared after a few years of a Labour government, and then they came back when the Tories came to power. It's almost like there's some really weird connection. But we don't have winter NHS crises now. They start last year, it started in summer. It actually started in summer, in August. Because what used to happen with these NHS winter crises is it would be a complete mess in winter, hence winter crisis, and the waiting lists would go up because you had to prioritize emergencies, of course, triage. And then what would happen is, as it got past winter and towards summer, then there was just enough capacity the waiting lists were still going up, don't get me wrong, it was never enough to clear the backlog, but it was enough to breathe a little bit. There weren't as many beds needed in hospitals, for example. There was still lots of outpatient stuff, but not so much inpatient stuff. They were able to clear the decks, summer come, and then back to winter again. Whereas now the problem is the decks aren't being cleared during the summer. So the crisis indeed starts in the summer now. And this is how it's going to be. This is how it's going to be this year. It's going to be how it's next year. It'll be how it is every year until... it's not even until Labour come in, because Labour are going to take a few years to sort something out. But, you know, in terms... You know, there was another thing. Okay, there's another thing. What was it now? There's a load of... was it triathletes or something? Have been fallen ill because the swimming in the sea and the quality of the water has made them ill. And this is, you know, this is a Brexit thing as well, because although it's not directly related to Brexit, we didn't have to have sewage in our waters because we left the EU. But we wouldn't have gotten away with it to this extent because we'd be taken to court. The European Court of Justice would say, you're breaking the law, you need to sort it out. Whereas that now doesn't happen. So when the Brexiteers said, for example, we don't want the European Court of Justice having jurisdiction, that's why. Because they wanted to lower standards. You know, shit in the rivers is just a thin end of the wedge, really. You've got UKCA mark being added to your musicians' electronics devices as well as see. Yeah, I've got some things as well that have got both on. I'm just having a look if this one. Oh, you probably can't see it because of my whatchamacallit, VCam. But yeah, there's the UKCA mark. But the important thing is they're always almost always alongside the CE mark. I think someone put up a picture of a pint glass today that just had the UKCA. But when I used one in summer, I took a photo of it and put it on Twitter, I think. It had both. It had both there. Do I remember a few years ago when the Tories decided to fully privatise Hinchinbrook Hospital? I don't know. Within 12 months, it was back in the public sector because staff mutilated. No, I don't remember that. The thing is, as far as I'm concerned, the NHS is already privatised. It actually is privatised at the moment. And I'll tell you why. It's not because absolutely every service is now delivered by a private company, although many now are, much more than people realise. It's because the NHS, it's not the Health Secretary and the Department for Health and Social Care deciding how funds are allocated within the NHS. There's individual NHS trusts. The government provide them guidelines and then budgets, and then the individual trusts decide how to spend those budgets to meet I would say to meet various targets, but there aren't really any targets. So to meet the guidelines, shall we say. Now, and this was a recent change. This is in the last year. There are now providers of private healthcare sitting on those boards that decide how NHS resources are spent. At that point, I just have to regard the NHS as actually privatised. It's privatised, only it's not private insurance based. It's still a public insurance base, but it is privatised. Much like energy is. Like energy is privatised. You can almost like think of you paying your fees there as almost like a tax, but it's still privatised. Nobody should be running anything which involves others unless they have a healthy emotional intelligence. Yeah, unfortunately, there's a bit of a problem with that, in that people without any emotional intelligence at all are the most motivated to climb the career ladder. Brexit's like taking the stabilisers off a bike. Some kids work out okay, some crash into a wall. I don't know how we were going to do anything different. Then you have Rees-Mogg riding his penny farthing into a skip and cause it to explode into flame. Yeah, I don't think there was any way of flying with Brexit at all. It's just, it didn't have to be as bad as it is. So if we pick on a few things that didn't have to come with Brexit. So clean water, for example, we didn't have to abandon clean water. We didn't have to do that. That's our choice to lower standards. We didn't, I mean, just, it depends what you mean by Brexit as well, because if Brexit means Brexit, well, no. because leaving the EU was one thing, leaving the single market and the customs union was something entirely different. But even if you go along, because the Tories very early on said, oh yeah, we're going to have to leave the single market and the customs union. So once you got, and we sort of knew that was happening really from the start. So once you got that into your head, there were still other things we didn't have to do. We didn't have to abandon security arrangements with the EU. We didn't have to, have such a, given that we were going to have to come up with our own immigration system, it didn't have to be so piss poor. An immigration system is supposed to match workers to your jobs. By definition, the occupation shortage list should detail all the occupations where you cannot fill vacancies by definition. And that's not what it is. It's political. You're saying Starmer is Blair apparent. I think you're going to realise, Phil, in a few years' time that is not the case at all. Any news coming from Labour specifically this week? I'm not sure specifically, no. It's been mostly selecting candidates. I'm off tomorrow to a hustings to select our parliamentary candidate. So there are 3 candidates. One of them doesn't seem that strong, really. A couple of them seem all right, though, but we'll get there. Uncle Social saying there, Hinchinbrook was fully privatised in 2014. Read the story of how it turned into a financial disaster where patients were treated as commodities and the project was doomed from the start. But this is always the case, isn't it? Like, ultimately, the difference between capitalism and socialism is socialism understands that a public service has to prioritise the service. Yes, you need to run it. You've got to run you can't just say money's no object. Of course it is. People don't want to pay through the nose. So you've got to manage a budget. You have got to sometimes make tough financial decisions, yes. But the priority is the service. Whether it's succeeding or not is it delivering the service? Whereas when a private company, any private company, even one, especially one, delivering a public service, the priority is profit. The success of the management, the people who run it, is determined by, did we make a profit? And if so, how much? So it's fundamentally unsuitable. The only way you can ever make an essentially privatized public service work, and in some countries they sort of do, but it costs extra, is to heavily regulate it. Because you cannot trust the executives to prioritize the service, right? So the government have to do it for them. The government have to say, right, you are going to prioritize the service. That is what Labour are going to do with water companies, for example. They are going to force them to prioritize the service, and they'll do that. But at the moment, the policies are obviously anything can be tweaked, but I don't expect these to be changed much. Why would they? To first of all say, if we fine you, you're paying that fine. You don't just put up prices and make the customers pay it. The fine is levied on you. To say, these are your targets. If you don't, you prioritize these targets over your dividends. To also make sure Ofwat, the ombudsman's got teeth, and say, you're not just going to jack up the prices to pay for all the stuff you're supposed to be doing, as well as your big profits. And also to strike off company directors, like executives, who keep breaking the rules. So, and again, the facts, a lot of this we wouldn't have to do. The one of the biggest arguments in my mind that unfortunately wasn't really made about why we needed to stay in the EU is it was pretty much the only defence we had against a rampant Conservative government. Because what we're seeing of the Conservatives right now is them unchained. Without, because when they sort of said like, oh, the EU are dictating to us, it's like the us wasn't us, the us was them. Yes, the EU dictated to the Tories, not us. And so I like to think there's a substantial difference between someone appealing to the centre-left out of pragmatism in order to win more votes and actually being a Blairite. There's a world of difference. For example, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were very similar politically, but there was a difference between Blairism and Brownism, for example. But anyway, you say he's using the Blair playbook, follows all the Tory policies. Name me one. We said this on Wednesday, didn't we, Phil? I asked you to name a policy. If that was to do with me, you didn't say it. Say one now. Name a Tory policy that Labour have adopted. I think you'll find the only policies in common are the ones that the Tories have adopted that Labour argued for. But you name me a single right-wing policy that Labour have adopted. I challenge you again. Will you answer this time? Are there any services that have transferred to the private sector that have been successful? Not in this country now. I can't think of one anyway. The only one that's even close, you could argue, is Channel 4, but it's a bit of a weird one, that, because it's not privatised, as it's not run by, but it is run as a business. So, you know, it's responsible for raising its own revenue. This is what Nadine Dorris's culture secretary learned, that it doesn't actually receive taxpayer money. It funds itself. So, but so that's a funny one. It is a nationalised, effectively a nationalised thing, but it is run as if it were privatised. Only it's not. So that's the closest. I can't think of an actual private service, as in has shareholders, private service that is successful. And ultimately, the problem on, you say you named one Wednesday, I ignored it. I did not. You say Starmer supports the 2-child benefit cap. So do most Labour supporters, though. And also, what is the purpose of removing the 2-child benefit cap to address child poverty? Well, what if he addresses child poverty some other way? Ultimately, that's the issue with the 2-child cap. Because really, in fact, the whole concept of benefits is itself like a capitalist system. We shouldn't have people on benefits at all. People shouldn't need to be on universal credit or any of these benefits. People should be able to have a reasonable income themselves. And if we cannot provide suitable work for everyone, then we should be having some form of universal basic income, shouldn't we? So by arguing for removing the cap, and removing the cap would be a really good way to alleviate child poverty, but it's not supported. It's not even supported by Labour voters, I should say. I imagine most Labour members would like it removed. But Labour voters, majority of them want it to stay. So it's one that will allow the Tories into power. If you back it, you back an unpopular move, what happens? You lose power. Now, if after a few years of Labour being in power, child poverty has not been alleviated, then you've got cause to complain. But ultimately, that's it. If you're thinking, oh, they shouldn't be adopting this policy, then that's an ideology. The outcome is child poverty going to be alleviated under Labour? And I absolutely will guarantee that by the time they go into the polls again, for the hopefully defending their time in government, child poverty will be considerably less. That is the metric to judge it by. You don't judge it by a particular policy. You don't say, oh, they're not doing this, therefore getting it wrong. It's like, well, why do I want that? To reduce child poverty. Will they reduce child poverty? It's the same thing with the Public Order Bill, or the Public Order Act now. Ultimately, what do we want? We want people to not be criminalised for what is a genuinely peaceful protest. So when Labour are in power, will people be arrested for genuinely peaceful protest? If they are, will the police actually be punished for it because they've got it wrong? Or will the police have acted properly? That's the metric. You judge it on those things. And also, it's not a cap isn't a right-wing policy. Either benefits are a right-wing policy or they're not. If the benefit is not a right-wing policy, then the cap is not a right-wing policy. Remember, right-wing politics is two things, and exactly two things. First of all, low regulation. Well, it's actually three things, I suppose, technically, but the third one comes as a result of the other two. Low regulation, low public spending. You can also argue low tax, but if you have low public spending and low regulation, you can have low tax. You can have no economy if you get it wrong, but you can have low tax. You say Starmer's against free school meals, as are the Tories. No, he's not. He's just said he can't guarantee to fund them. He hasn't ruled that out. He said he cannot guarantee to be able to fund them. That doesn't mean to say he won't fund them. Again, that's another. You're not thinking of the metric. The metric is child poverty. Not everyone needs free school meals. So what if he comes up with a system of targeting it to make sure everyone because the issue surely is that everyone should have a school meal. Now, if when Labour in power, everyone is entitled to a school meal, what difference does it make if the ones who can afford it pay for it and the ones who can't don't? You're not going to convince me by blind ideology is very dangerous. You need to think about outcomes. What do you actually want? You want children not to be poor. So look at its stats when Labour have been in power. Anyway, we're going to get back onto Brexit because I did say this would be back. It's quite weird. I hardly ever do these on Brexit. I talk about Brexit quite a lot. And then when I try and do it on Brexit, we're talking about other things. Brian saying, I've been a Labour Party member for 45 years, and yesterday, for the first time since I moved to France 20 years ago, I've received my membership card. Is this an omen? Like, I don't know. I haven't. Like, my membership card, where's it gone? It's from when I lived in Scunthorpe. It was quite a few years ago now. That's a few years ago. They know I live here. It's not that they haven't updated their systems. They know I live here. I get all the mail and everything for this constituency. I just haven't got a new membership card. Do I think a good tactic from Labour spokesperson will be to say we've inherited a mess, we've inherited a mess, we've inherited a mess, just like the Tories did in 2010 onwards? Yes, it's not even just a good tactic, it's an obvious tactic. They're already doing it now. They're doing it nice and early. They are they keep saying, there's several members of their front bench keep saying the phrase, they want to under-promise and over-deliver. So that straight away tells you that whatever at the moment they're not guaranteeing, some of it is going to happen anyway. Note the difference. Whatever they're ruling out, bear in mind, we don't know when the election is. Come the election, they may no longer be ruling it out. But whatever they're ruling out, probably they are ruling out. But whatever they're simply refusing to back, that means they're sort of hoping they can do it. It's just that to win the election, 100%, they have to say that their budget has to be balanced. If it's not balanced, if there's any daylight at all, then it will be seized upon mercilessly and they will lose. It's really that's it. When I say things like Rishi Sunak cannot win the next election, that is on the basis of how Labour have been operating the last few years. If they suddenly started operating like idiots, then yes, of course Sunak can still win. Do I think Labour will investigate bringing schools back under LA control? Now the last research said those under control perform better than academies. Neither. I don't think so. Never mind. I was going to say, Phil's saying Brexit's meaningless. How is Brexit meaningless? We've lost a load of our rights because of Brexit. You're about to lose a load of employment rights because of Brexit. Gone. Until Labour come back in. Gone. We've lost a load of environmental standards. We've lost a load of consumer rights, civic protections, civic rights we've lost. Meaningless. Where was I? Sorry. About the schools thing. So obviously Starmer's main reform is about giving more decision making to regions, which may even include, although I don't know, it may actually I mean, surely it would have to include tax raising powers as well, proper tax raising powers. So it may well be that naturally, without a specific policy on schooling, it may well be that those regions are. So imagine two like different regions. You might have like the northeast of England, you might have the southwest of England, for example, and it might almost be left up to them. So if one of those regions decides actually we're happy with academies, then they'd have the power to go ahead with them. And if the other one said, no, we're not happy, we're going to bring them under our control, they'd be able to do that as well. So that's my sort of reading. Remember, Keir Starmer's main mission in government is actually to remove power from himself. It's actually to stop the government to stop there to being too much central decision making. That's his big thing. He's just not pitching it because it's maybe not what voters are particularly bothered about. And so I don't know what you think, but I think the benefit system is an excuse for the Tories to be able to moan about various groups of people. It is, because the transfer to universal credit, for example, was an example of this, because what they do is they characterize people on benefits as not working, and in most cases as just can't be asked to find a job, can't be asked to graft or anything like that. And that works, and it works in a couple of ways. First of all, it works because the Tories mostly are chasing seats in more affluent areas where unemployment is naturally low, right? So in other words, you don't have lots more people than jobs that they can go for. So whereas you tend to get the higher unemployment in sort of areas that the Tories before 2019 actually tended not to bother with. So it sort of works because to a lot of their voters, they'll look around going, well, you can get work here, you can get work easily enough here. There's loads of jobs here. Yeah, there's loads of jobs in the southeast of England. Absolutely. But so it works on that level. The other thing is, by having universal credit, it lumped together people who weren't employed with people who were, but were on slave wages, so needed it topping up. And one thing I find particularly galling about it is it's described as a benefit to the recipient, but it's not. If you're on universal credit and in work, the benefit is your employer. Because if that like was working tax credits, it's folded into universal credit really now, isn't it? If that benefit didn't exist, then that person couldn't do that job, and that employer would be forced to either, have to downgrade their business or pay more. So really, that benefit is going to business owners. It's not the recipient's benefit. They should be paid higher wages if they cannot afford to live on their wage and they're working full time. I mean, let us remind ourselves that there was a time, a couple of generations ago, when people in this country, in lots of Western countries, you could afford everything on one income. The traditional nuclear family where the fellow went to work and very often the wife did not. And they managed everything. Whereas now we've got both people working and many of them still can't. And they're working full time and many of them still cannot afford to make ends meet. Will Labour be able to get away with delaying border checks, or will be forced to implementing it quite quickly? It's a tricky question. The problem is, in terms of the smuggling that's going on, it's like that's not a political massive issue. The issue is if something really bad happens. So if, for example, there's an outbreak that wipes out a load of our farming, then that's trouble, because if it's, bear in mind, you do sometimes get that. Like we've had avian flu, for example, and no one's really pointed to the standards controls as the issue there. But if anyone is able to point to an outbreak and says this would not have happened if we'd have had proper standards controls, that's when it becomes problematic, because if it happens on Labour's watch, like if it happens 2 weeks into Labour government, then even the Daily Express will struggle to blame it on Labour. But if it happens, say, a year in, if it happens after a year, the mainstream media will be merciless. They will absolutely blame Labour for it. So it's tricky. Like the Conservatives know that it will be really bad if it happens on their watch. Like if we have a major outbreak like now or any time before the election, they will really be for it. They will be for it. But the mainstream media will downplay it. Their client media at least will downplay it a little bit. Or they'll just describe it as one of those things. Or they'll somehow blame the EU for it, right? They won't do that for Labour. So it is really tricky. Really tricky. Hi, Adam. Would it be a popular move for Starmer to bang on about abolishing the laws? I'd have thought it would appeal to target voters. There's so much more ammunition against the Tories there. They probably think not. So they spend a lot of time polling to identify their target voters and what it is that those target voters are most interested in. The issue with reform, any sort of parliamentary reform, is like I can look at it, and maybe you can look at it and see, if we reform Parliament, a lot of the problems of the country go away. Like my big thing is going to be proportional representation. If we had proportional representation for Westminster, a lot of the problems we have would not exist. But that's not necessarily how voters will see it. Voters will see it as like ideological, like political theory. And it's like, right, no, what we want is to be able to afford food, right? And in the winter, heating as well, if you don't mind. So that's why I think the other issue with the Lords thing and this parliamentary reform is, it's like some people say, well, Starmer needs a vision. Why doesn't he have a vision? And I'm always in two minds when I hear people say that, because on the one hand, I think to myself, well, he does. He's trying to promote the removal of power from Westminster and devolve it. That is a vision. There's no two ways about it. At the same time, you have to concede, but he's not pushing it. But then I think to myself, is the reason he's not pushing it is because vote? Remember what happened in 2019? In 2019, the Labour manifesto, individually, in isolation, was popular. People liked the proposals. The people weren't pointing to anything going, no, I don't want that, I don't want that. They wanted it. They just didn't believe that Labour would deliver it, right? Now, there's an argument that if Keir Starmer starts presenting this grand vision, that the same will happen. Because the voters have been stung. They've been stung by the Brexit vision that didn't pan out. Boris Johnson, it was, David Cameron's vision, that hurt. Boris Johnson's vision, that hurt. They're going to get Rishi Sunak's vision. So maybe Labour have worked out that actually what they need is just to, after all the grand visions that have turned to dust, maybe they're identifying that what voters just want is bread and butter politics, focusing on what are their day-to-day problems. If you have visions, consult a doctor. I don't know. Some great inventions have come as a result of visions. Parcel Rogue, I'm encouraged by Labour baby steps towards PR voting. Just hope it doesn't end like the Blair-Ashdown agreement in 97. UK's future would be doomed. Well, you could argue what doomed it was failing to implement proportional representation at the time. Should have been done at the time. Absolutely should have been done. And everything that the Tories have done was done because we didn't have proportional representation. Let me go back to. You can never just sort of literally go back to general election results and say, if we had proportional representation, this would have happened. Because if we had proportional representation, the way people would have chosen to vote would have been very different. But let me just try and find what I'm looking for. So, yes. No, that's not what I'm looking for. Hang on. I can't find it. Maybe I need to look it on the BBC. I'm trying to look it on Wikipedia. And they've got loads of really interesting things on there, but not what I'm after at the moment. Right, votes. Yes, so it would have been possible. I thought this was right. I thought I'd check. In 2010, let's say the voting had still been as it was, and it wouldn't have been. Proportional representation meant that, the voting wouldn't have been like that. But if it had been, Labour and the Liberal Democrats could have formed a coalition. Now, that doesn't mean that the Liberal Democrats would have formed a coalition with Labour. They may still have gone for the Conservatives, but they would have had a stronger hand. They would, for example, if they were really insistent, could have said no to austerity. My main concern with PR will be the Tory media will deride it and swing voters will be turned off. Yes, but what's the difference between that and now where we're not getting it? So that has to happen. The Tory media will fight tooth and nail against it like nothing else. It'll be like the campaign to end all campaigns. They will fight it like nothing else. Because I'll tell you another thing that will come with PR. We will get proper media reform. Proper media reform. Because the people who will be collectively getting over 50% of the votes consistently are not the people the media do any favours for. So I'm actually wanting that. I want the PR campaign to get to the point where the Tory media properly... Every now and then, they write an article saying how terrible it would be, but it's just every now and then, just when it sticks its head up above the parapet. I want a PR campaign to go properly public to force the media to rage against it, because I want to test it out. I want to test public opinion. At the moment, we know the public are in favour of reform and they're in favour of PR. But how strong is that support? Until it is tested, until we allow the Tories and their client media to really attack it, we don't know how strong that support is. How powerful are the Mail, Tory, Sun, Torygraph and Express now? At the moment, quite powerful, not necessarily because of their influence on their readers, but we know, for example, that ministers take them very seriously. And it really doesn't matter whether they are all that influential on voters anymore or not, because that's a different question. If ministers believe they are, then they are. As far as they're concerned, they're still shaping government policy if they believe they are. Now, I don't know whether they are or not. I don't know whether they are or not. Pastor Rogue saying Beckett, Brown and Prescott squash PR in 97. Yeah, there's always been a lot of resistance to PR, influential resistance to PR within Labour. And it's really this, there's two sides to it. I've said this before. It's like there are some parts of the country which is very strong Labour. And if you had PR, it's like those seats wouldn't be as safe. Labour would get seats around the country, but they wouldn't get as many in their heartlands. They'd have to fight much harder for them. So there's some, MPs who quite like sitting on large majorities, which is a bit selfish. But the other side of it is some of them will actually accept Conservative governments in return for 100% power every now and then. And which is, again, very selfish way of looking at it. Because with PR, of course, Labour would never get 100% power. If a future Labour government under PR had this grand vision for the country, yeah, it's going to be tempered by whoever your coalition partners are. If they're not fully on board with it, you might get some of it. You might even get the bulk of it because you're the senior partner in the coalition, you hope. But you won't be getting all of it. And that's the thing. But what I think Labour members are realising now, certainly I hope this is the reason, because the support is not dying down. What they're seeing is the Tories are staying in power too long. Maybe there was a time when it was sort of like they'd be in for one or two parliaments, then Labour would come back in. But now they're in too long. You know, they were in for 18 years under Thatcher and Major and caused irreparable damage. And then they're going to have been in 14 years by next year. If we have a general election next May, it'll have been 14 years again. It's too much damage. It's one thing to let them in for 5 years and then you come back in, even though you still end up with overall damage, net damage. You can't repair it all. It's still a short-sighted way of looking at it. Because the bottom line is, it doesn't matter what people think of the Lib Dems or the Greens or anyone like that. In coalition with them, they're not going to cause actual damage. At worst, you may believe they won't pursue progressive policies as quickly as you like, but then they'll think the same as you, because that's the thing about those parties. They're all have different ideas. They all want what's best for people. They just have different ideas about what that is. The public are not in favour of Starmer, though, are they? Yes. He's like the most popular politician. Now, if you're going to say, aren't there more people against Starmer than for him? Well, yes, but that's also par for the course for every politician. That doesn't matter. He's not going to win the majority of the public. And even some of those who don't approve of him will still vote for him or vote for his party. One angry pagan saying, would you agree with me that absolutist thinking in politics is futile? So many fellows on the left just cannot seem to accept they can't get everything we want. Really isn't helpful. This is the difference between the hard left and the soft left. The hard left will say, this is what I want because this is the best for the country, right? This is objectively the best thing for the country. And if we did all this, you know, the vulnerable would be taken care of. You know, people would be free. Social mobility would be awesome. So the most able people would rise to the top and drive progress, and it'll all be fantastic. And that's what I believe as well, right? However, people don't believe that. The majority of the country do not believe it. So where you're left with is you must either, there's only two options left open to you, right? Option number one is you compromise with people so that you can get power and get some of what you think is best for the country. Or you don't, and you get nothing. And it's really that simple. The idea of, I mean, these people will often, you know, some of these people, shall I say, some of these people will then often descend into we need a revolution, missing 2 points. First of all, what you're talking about, therefore, is to force your fellow citizens, the people you think you've got the best interests at heart in, you want to force them at gunpoint to do what you say. That's what an armed revolution is. And secondly, there's no popular support because we don't need... An armed revolution is for dictatorships. When the people have no political power, that is when you get revolutions that are driven by the people. There's no such thing as a people's revolution in a democracy because you don't need to. If you don't like the government, you go and put your pencil tick in a different box. Starmer's recorded being at Murdoch's birthday bash in 2009, and this would be round about the time he was taking his staff to court. Is that what you're talking about? Also dinner with Rebecca Brooks. Yeah, he took her to court. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? Asked to remind you, want to explain why there's a slim chance for autumn general election? Oh, yes, thank you. Right, okay, well, let's go on to that. We've been all over the place today. Let's get rid of this rogues gallery. Where is it? So if we're thinking about in Tories' strategy, will they go for an autumn general election? So I've talked in the past of it would probably be their best bet because what's coming next year could be absolutely catastrophic for them. But this is how electoral calculus has the prediction at the moment. Now, do bear in mind, no system is perfect. This is based on MRP polling. It has its drawbacks. They all have their drawbacks. But at the moment, there's no credible way of trying to work out how an election would go that doesn't have the Conservatives losing the vast majority of their seats that they currently have. You know, look at this. 2019, they won 365 seats. They haven't quite got that now. 365 seats. They are predicted with this to win 116, and that's an improvement compared to a few weeks ago. That is an improvement. So you can't look at this and go, shall we go for an election this autumn? There's no way the Tories will look. They will. You know how it. I'll tell you. You know how it is when you've got a dilemma in your life, and you don't really want to make that decision. So you sort of hope that something turns up to avoid what you know is the right decision, but very painful decision. You know, we all do it. Our brain is quite good at going, there, just wait a little bit. It'll sort of, something might turn up. Well, that's the mode that Tory MPs will be in at the moment. Because yes, there'll be ones there who can think, and they'll be thinking, come next year, the mortgage crisis will be way worse. If you look at anything, the situation will be way worse. But they think, well, at least inflation will be better. So there's that little thing, oh, well, maybe inflation will be better. And then we'll be, and then what? The interest rate's going to come down then? Oh, no, they're not going to come down. They'll just stop going up. So they're going to stay high. But that's where they are at the moment. They're looking at this and thinking, we cannot go for an election when it looks like this. Rishi Sunak is thinking to himself, he wants to win the election. Doesn't matter how credible we think that is. He thinks he can try and win the election. He's not going to call a general election when the polling looks like this. He thinks that next year the inflation will be lower next year. Of course it will. He thinks inflation will be lower. He thinks immigration figures will be lower. And they probably will, because apart from anything else, the latest figures, remember, were padded out with refugees from Ukraine and Hong Kong. So he thinks the immigration figures will be lower. He thinks the inflation will be lower. He probably now recognises that waiting lists won't be lower, but he might try and say they are anyway. Like he keeps trying to say that, in fact, there's been a few lies he's told that he still hasn't corrected. He's tried to say that crime, or the Tories in general are trying to say that crime levels are down compared to 2010. It's like, no, they're not, they're higher. And then he tried to say, what was the other one? Was he trying to say something like the asylum backlog was way higher under... He tried to say it was double under Labour, and it's like, no, it was like a few percent of what it is now. Just like literally single figures percent or something. But the Tories are thinking some things will be better next year, like inflation will be better, the immigration figures will be better. But, and they're not thinking to themselves, yeah, but there'll be other things that are worse. So, yeah, that's why I don't think autumn, because you look at this and you go, you can't call a general election when the polls say this is what's going to happen to you. You'd be mental, absolutely mental. So, in a way, like, it would be different if it looked like they were going to lose and be stuck on something like 250. If the polling suggested that Labour would win a slender majority, like, look, let's take the extremes on this, because you can see that it's got low seats, high seats. So let's say the Conservatives, this high seats of 246 and the Labour low seats of 329. If the polling suggested that that was the likely outcome, that Labour would win 329 seats, which is a majority, but it's not a comfortable majority, and the Conservatives would win 246 seats, I think they would go for an election this autumn. I think there's a good chance of that. The main downside could be not having the conference, which is a money spinner for them. It's been pointed out the Tory party conference is a money spinner for them. But all things considered, if that high seats for the Tories and low seats for Labour was the predicted seat situation, the median, so to speak, I think they would go for it this autumn. But it's not. It's truly terrible. Yeah, I'm assuming they aren't mental there. Well, when it comes to self-preservation, no, because predicted 116 seats, even given that they think their genius strategist Isaac Leverdow will, improve things for them, nonetheless, you're still talking about, it's like, get all the Tory MPs together, right? Get them all together in a big old room. And what those results say is that 2 out of every 3 of them are going to lose their seats. That is the reality. 2 out of every 3 Tory MPs that exist right now will be ex-Tory MPs come the election. I mean, some of them will be anyway, because they're stepping down. I noticed the latest is Nadine Dorries. There's moves to force her to either turn up to Parliament or bugger off, using a 200-year-old rule or something. But anyway. Winning an election from jail is a thing in Northern Ireland. I think Trump's going to be hoping it's a thing in America as well. Sunak assumes that, like everything else in his past, something will come along to solve his problems for him. Do you know what? He probably hasn't had any problems up until now. What problems has he had? I've not read any biography of him or anything, but I can't imagine he's had too many problems. He was brought up in extreme privilege, and he made a lot of money. He became multimillionaire very young. I mean, he's worth £250 million on his own, married into the family of one of the richest billionaires in India. So, yeah, I don't think he's had too many problems. And this is why he gets irritated, I think. It's the same with Boris Johnson, wasn't it? They get irritated when people tell them they're wrong. They're not suited to politics, not just because they're not practical people, but because they get really upset when someone challenges them. Well, the job, politician, it's par for the course being challenged as a politician. Sometimes you'll be challenged fairly. Sometimes you'll be challenged unfairly. There's no point in getting upset about it. Notes, no one thinks he's got an actual plan to make anything better. Sunak's just hoping something will break his way. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, look at his 5 pledges. Let's go through his 5 pledges. He made them at the start of the year, said, judge me on these. So he thought he was going to achieve them. But then think about what he was doing to achieve them. Halving inflation. So what are the government's policies to bring inflation under control? Squeezing public sector pay. It's not really a policy. That is procrastination masquerading as a policy. But that's it. That's all. They haven't actually done anything. You know, they've not done anything to ease. They've not identified the main source of it. Like, okay, one thing the government could have easily done is, like everyone else kept saying them to do, apply windfall taxes to the oil and gas companies, use the money to compensate the energy companies for the higher wholesale price of gas, which at the moment there is no higher. It's actually, not record. It's a lows not seen for years, the price of gas. But so why aren't we reducing energy bills back down to where they were? That average of roughly £100 a month. Why aren't we doing that? That would reduce inflation. He had that option and he didn't take it. So it's not like there aren't policies he couldn't have backed. He could have done. He could have allowed farmers to get in more workers. He could have said, have as many seasonal visas as you want. He could have said, get your work, because we know that British people aren't doing that work. We know that. So why didn't he just say, if you can find the workers, the Home Office will let them come here as easily as possible. That way we could have produced more food. That would have reduced food inflation a bit. Yes, you're going to have high food inflation when some random nutter decides to invade a massive agricultural nation in Europe. Of course you are. But there are still things he could have done and chose not to. Next one down the list. I can't even remember them now. There was growing the economy. Well, his plans now is to go for a recession. But again, what was he doing to try and boost the economy? What was he doing? What's he done to try and boosting the economy means allowing businesses to thrive. Well, he put up their energy bills. Well, that made a load of them go under. He's applying effectively more taxes in terms of Brexit red tape. Well, that's not helping them. He's strangling their access to labour. Well, that's not helping them. What's he doing? Nothing. And now he's actively wanting a recession. So that's the opposite of growing the economy. Reducing national debt, that's a laugh. His budget, Hunt's budget, but he's approved it, of course, means loads of extra borrowing. In fact, the borrowing is going to carry on until they reckon they're going to start bringing it under control after the election. Now, what you mean is you're going to leave it for Labour to deal with. The NHS waiting list, what was his plan for that? He's now saying, oh, we're not going to be able to reduce waiting lists while these strikes go on. Well, the strikes were going on at the start of the year. And he knew he wasn't planning on giving them an above inflation linked pay rise. He knew that. So what was his plan to get waiting lists down? There isn't one. He's now talking about using more private sector capacity, much in line with what Labour are going to have to do, what they've said they're going to have to do. But again, there's no long-term plan for it. There's no building up. Like Labour's plan is to use private capacity to get the waiting list down, but to build up the NHS. So for the long term, they're not doing that. And then the last one was stop the boats. Well, the way you stop the boats is quite simple. You make sure you set up safe routes for asylum seekers. They don't have to use people smugglers. It's easy. Well, it's not easy. Nothing's ever easy. But that is what you do. You set up safe routes. You have a processing centre in France. If anyone does come over on a boat, you send them back. You go, the processing centre's just outside Calais. And off you go. In fact, we'll take you back. That would have been fine. The boats would have stopped overnight. Easy. And every time a boat did cross and they claimed asylum, you would just take them back to France. We would actually legally be able to do that. No messing from the courts, because that's where the processing centre would be. Again, he could have done something about all of these things. Apart from the borrowing, he was never going to be able to bring the borrowing down. That's not possible. But all of the others, all those other 4 things he could have done something about and has not done. So yes, that's a long-winded way of saying I absolutely agree. What he's doing is just hoping things naturally turn out. Just like Boris Johnson, he's just like a more sober version of Boris Johnson. Well, he is sober because he doesn't drink, but that's all he is. He's just waiting for the free market fairy to wave its magic wand. Do I think Sunak has surrounded himself with yes men? I certainly think he's surrounded himself with people who do not understand the first thing about political strategy. Not the first thing. That is evident. Whether he's surrounded himself with yes men, I do not know. But it is quite clear he is not getting political advice. Or if he is, he's not taking it. Really simple. If you add a recession to a recession, you get a double negative, so that should equal growth, yeah. That only works multiplicatively, not additively. What's the conclusion then? Is Rishi Sunak a pragmatic Brexiteer or just trapped? Oh yeah, I kept getting distracted. You kept distracting me. In all honesty, I actually do think he is just trapped, because the UKCA thing, you sort of think, after the Windsor framework, for me, I can understand why he didn't do a load of stuff when he first became PM, because he had a very low authority base. After the Windsor framework vote, he absolutely smashed that, completely obliterated the ERG. If he were a pragmatic Brexiteer, I would have expected, we might need the Rogues Gallery back, I would have expected him to, in fact, I think I said at the time, I'd have expected him to get moving on a few other issues as well. And he hasn't. And I think when you look at it, like, even the Windsor framework, I don't think he saw that as a good thing. I think he just thought to himself, I don't want a trade war with the EU, because that was the way it was heading. Remember, he had this Brexit bill, this like Northern Ireland Protocol bit of legislation flying through Parliament. He couldn't just stop it, because then he'd have looked like he was giving in. So he had to do something that allowed him to stop it. And the only possible thing was get an agreement with the EU. So I don't think that was him going, well, we should have I think that was him going, we need an agreement, otherwise it's a trade war, right? Which you can argue is pragmatic, but I would also say is just of necessity. It's not because he wants to be pragmatic, but because he had to be. It's the same thing with this indefinite abandoning of the UKCA thing, with the, saying to companies, look, if you have the CE mark, that should be fine for us. We'll accept that long term. He's only done that because it was cost. He needs the economy. He does actually need the economy to be boosted for next year. And this is something that was keeping businesses down. Like the chemical, anyone who works in the chemical industry will say there's real bad warning signs in the chemical industry, for example. The standards controls, we need the standards controls, but again, what would it have done? It would have created food shortages, medicine shortages, put prices of both up as well. Well, he's trying to control inflation, that would work against it. So again, it doesn't matter what he thinks about standards controls. He's delayed them because he's just thought, well, the economy can't take it. Everything he's done, you can look at it as the sort of thing a pragmatic Brexiteer would do, but you can also look at it as someone who was just trapped into it because they need the economy in decent shape for the election, or at least recovered shape for the election. And I just look at the timing. And for me, it took him too long to adopt some of these measures. The EU free movement included a clause to transport people out of the country for various reasons, crime, over borrowing, no means of support, etc. The UK did not do it because no resources. Yeah. Well, in terms of freedom of movement, there are always caveats as well. Like, for example, the same thing with free trade. Just to give a couple of examples of where sovereign countries can still look after their own interests. So during the pandemic, various EU countries did close their border. They restricted access, didn't they? Because it was an emergency situation. And the EU, they corroborated that. They sort of validated it. It's like, yeah, this is an emergency situation. But the other thing is, I mentioned recently the BSE, when I was talking about standards controls in Britain. When was that now? That was a long time ago. That was back in the 90s. So you had the BSE crisis, right? And that was when we were in the single market as well. And for example, France famously, for many years, even after we sorted ourselves out and we actually had the highest quality beef in the world after that, because obviously when you get hit, then in order to restore your reputation, the government has to get serious. So we raised standards sky high to the point where it was the safest in the world. But France continued to block the sale of British beef. And it's like, well, we're both in the single market. Where's this freedom? There are always caveats. There are always exceptions allowed in certain circumstances. So the idea that in the EU you don't get to sort of defend your border, so to speak, was an absolute nonsense. Then came foot and mouth. Well, foot and mouth is one of those things that keeps coming and going in this country. That goes a long way back. What's happened with interference in the Brexit referendum? Have the Tories managed to answer the ECHR's questions yet? I strongly suspect not. When it comes to the Brexit referendum, and I think basically now anything that dodgy, there's a lot of people that will go on about it and says, well, it was illegally run, it was a dishonest campaign, and it's almost like, yeah, it was, but I'm not sure how much mileage there is other than keep reminding people because a court has said so. There's nothing opinion about it. The High Court said that the campaign was run illegally, but it couldn't make any difference because the referendum was advisory, not binding, and therefore the reason we left the EU was nothing to do with the referendum because the referendum was illegal. It was because MPs voted for us to leave. Really that simple. But I don't think there's any value in it because it doesn't start. There was at the time before we left, because you could have used it to argue, let's have a real referendum without, even with the terms agreed, you could still make it binding on the terms we'd agreed with Remain as an option, but that didn't happen. Whereas where we are now, it's like, we will say, I will use the phrase rejoin the EU, but I sometimes stop myself and go, we should really just talk about joining the EU. Because rejoining the EU or reversing Brexit sort of implies going back to where we were, but we can't. You know, we can't get all of those conditions back. It's not the same process. We were a founding member of the EU, and it's not the same process as when we joined the EEC, which is a different beast. So it's more about joining the EU. So I think it's, you know, just better at this point not to forget about the referendum, because some of the characters will be there for the next campaign. But there's limited mileage in proving to people that it was dishonestly or illegally run now, because we now need a completely different campaign. Last one on here then, really quickly. Could Sunak be thinking that he could butter up the economy by rolling back a little on Brexit if the election then become more extreme regarding Brexit if he wins? Absolutely, yes. This is it. I don't actually know what he wants of Brexit. If he were to somehow win, what I will say is sensible Tory strategy is always to reduce the pain in the year before an election. The aim is always to loosen it a bit. You know, increase public spending, reduce taxes, do what you can to make people feel that things are getting better. It's always a con. As soon as the election's over, it's back to the squeeze. But that is what they do. The problem for Rishi Sunak is he hasn't been, he hasn't really got anything to play with. You know, he can't lower taxes without causing another mess. He can't increase public spending. Well, he doesn't want to, but he can't anyway. He could if he stopped spending so much on outsourcing to Tory donors, but he's not going to do that. So there we go. Join the EU properly this time. Well, we'll have no option, will we? We'll have no option because we won't be a founding member. So we won't get a load of special deals. You get some. I'm not saying we get nothing, but we won't know what we'll get. There's one thing I think we definitely will get, but you know, you can't rule anything in. You can rule some things out, but you can't rule anything in. You could say rejoin the EU on revised terms. Well, yeah, well, you could. And I think I should just say join the EU, because the other thing is we'll fundamentally be a different country when we do that. Anyway, you look at Ireland. Ireland are like always talking up membership of the EU. You know, when there's an EU project, I mean, in this country where there was EU projects, there was always like a plaque funded by the EU type thing. But it's like they polish it every day in Ireland. You know, they're really proud of EU membership. There's no begrudgment or anything like that. Like nothing but full support for their own membership. So in order for the UK to join, we're basically going to have to, I think, become like that. We need a political critical mass that's really, because we can't just turn up to the EU and go, look, we'd like to join. Are you really serious? Well, we might as well. That's not going to cut it. We'll have to be really gung-ho. Yes, we want to join. We will be like the biggest Europhiles you've ever seen in your life. And we will. The great Labour advantage, we are less corrupt, so have more money to spend on actual government. Well, yeah, there's two things Labour will be able to do to increase spending a little, even though they say, oh, we're not really under spending. It's like, well, look, first of all, they won't be shelling out on Tory donors at all, and I hope they won't be shelling out on Labour donors, but apart from anything else, there's not as many of them, so it can't cost us as much. So yeah, about the less corruption, you would be right. So inevitably that gives you more money to spend on actual public services. And the second thing is, we know they're getting rid of some tax breaks. Will they get rid of all the ones I'd want them to get rid of? I don't know. But they're getting rid of some. When you get rid of a tax break, you raise more, well, you don't raise more taxes. Well, you do raise more taxes. But it's like you're certainly not giving more back, if you see what I mean. So Labour will get more money than the Conservatives will. It may not be loads, it may be a few billion, it might be like 10 billion or something, but that can still go a long way. But anyway, we've properly run over here. Thanks very much for coming on anyway, everyone. Have a very good evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.